In 1982, a warrior sat alone on the steps of a burning temple, and a generation of moviegoers thought that was the end of his story. But that final image, the one carved into the memory of millions, was not the only ending ever filmed. Somewhere in a vault, another version of that same moment existed, quietly removed, rarely discussed, and almost forgotten. Tonight, we go looking for it. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is the place where we dig past the trailers, past the DVD bonus features, and into the real paper trail of classic cinema. We track down the deleted scenes, the abandoned scripts, the fights nobody wanted to talk about, and the moments a studio decided the world didn't need to see. Today, we are stepping into the world of steel, conflict, and prophecy. This is the hidden history of Conan the Barbarian. On the surface, this looks like a simple story. A boy loses everything. A man rises from slavery. He gets his revenge. Roll credits. But the deeper you dig into how this film was actually built, the more you realize the version that reached theaters in 1982 was only one possible Conan, assembled from a much larger, much stranger pile of footage and ideas. There were scripts that never got used. There were scenes shot and then locked away. There was a whole ending sequence that audiences did not see for years. And there was a battle behind the camera between a producer who wanted a toy commercial and a director who wanted to make something closer to a religious epic. What survived that battle became a classic. What got left on the cutting room floor became a mystery that fans are still piecing together decades later. So let's start at the beginning, because the beginning of Conan the Barbarian is stranger than most people realize. The idea of putting Conan on screen had been floating around Hollywood since the early 1970s. A producer named Edward Pressman spent years just trying to secure the rights to Robert E. Howard's pulp stories. It took him roughly 2 years of negotiation before he even had a legal claim to make the movie. Once he had the rights, he still didn't have the money. Pressman pitched the project to every major studio he could reach, and every major studio passed. This was long before fantasy epics were considered safe box office. Executives looked at a barbarian swordsman story and saw a gamble nobody wanted to fund. Desperate to keep the project alive, Pressman eventually sold it to Dino De Laurentiis, one of the most powerful and unpredictable producers in the business. De Laurentiis had already scored a massive hit with a campy, colorful science fiction picture called Flash Gordon, and according to people close to the production, he wanted Conan to follow that same formula. Bright, playful, merchandisable. A pulpy adventure with a pop soundtrack that kids could enjoy on a Saturday afternoon. The man he hired to direct it had almost the opposite vision. John Milius was already known in Hollywood as an intense, uncompromising filmmaker, the kind of director who treated pulp adventure as if it were scripture. He did not see Conan as a cartoon. He saw him as a mythic figure, closer to a Norse saga or a Greek tragedy than a comic book. Milius took over rewriting an earlier script that had been drafted by a young screenwriter named Oliver Stone, fresh off his experiences in Vietnam. Stone's original draft leaned into a far more brutal, almost apocalyptic version of the story. Milius reshaped it, blending elements of Howard's pulp fiction with the visual language of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai and the ghost story Kwaidan. What emerged was something closer to a solemn war film wrapped in a sword and sorcery skin. This is where the first real crack in the production begins to show, because from almost the very start, Milius and De Laurentiis were building 2 different movies in their heads, and only one of them was going to survive the edit. The tension wasn't limited to tone. It showed up in the casting room too. De Laurentiis reportedly had doubts about Schwarzenegger from very early on, worried that his heavy accent would make him difficult for American audiences to understand. Stories from the set describe an early, tense exchange between the two men, and De Laurentiis openly discussing the idea of replacing him. Milius held his ground. He is said to have told the producer that if they didn't already have Schwarzenegger, they would have had to invent him from scratch. That single decision, fighting to keep an unknown Austrian bodybuilder in the lead role, ended up shaping the next 4 decades of Hollywood history. It's easy to forget now, watching Conan the Barbarian as a launching pad for one of the biggest stars in movie history, that the man in the title role almost wasn't there at all. Filming took place across 5 brutal months in Spain, largely in the same rugged landscapes Sergio Leone had used for his westerns years earlier. The production designer, Ron Cobb, built sets inspired by Dark Age architecture and by the fantasy paintings of artist Frank Frazetta, the same style that had defined Conan in the public imagination for decades. Milius made a deliberate choice to avoid heavy use of optical effects. Instead, he wanted his monsters, his giant snake, his sorcery, achieved through practical, mechanical, in-camera illusions whenever possible. It gave the film a texture that still holds up today, but it also meant a punishing, dangerous shoot. Arnold Schwarzenegger, still relatively unknown as an actor, performed the vast majority of his own stunts. During one sequence involving attacking wolves, he was actually injured, his back scratched open by one of the animals, then further hurt in a fall down a rocky slope. His co-star, Sandahl Bergman, playing the warrior Valeria, hurt her finger on a real sword during filming. The red liquid used elsewhere in the movie was reportedly mixed from vodka and fruit juice when the fake liquid supply ran short. This was not a controlled, sanitized studio shoot. It was closer to survival filmmaking, and that intensity bled directly into the footage Milius was capturing. And that footage, by most accounts, was extremely intense. Milius shot the battles, the confrontations, and the cult rituals with an unflinching eye, treating the intensity as essential to the story's meaning rather than as shock value. This is where the first documented conflict with De Laurentiis becomes impossible to ignore. According to people involved with the production, De Laurentiis was uncomfortable with just how harsh the finished footage looked. He had not signed on to fund a grim meditation on violence and faith. He had signed on to make a hit adventure picture with toy and merchandising potential. As the editing process stretched on for more than a year, a significant amount of the harsher material was trimmed down or removed entirely. Several sequences that had been shot with a much harder edge were softened before the film reached its final assembly. The Conan the Barbarian that audiences eventually saw in theaters was already a negotiated compromise, filtered through more than a year of arguments about exactly how much darkness a mainstream audience could handle. But the intensity wasn't the only battlefield. There was also a fight over the film's soul, expressed through music. De Laurentiis wanted a pop-oriented soundtrack, similar in spirit to what had worked so well for Flash Gordon. Milius pushed back hard, insisting the film needed a full orchestral score to match its mythic scale. He brought in a composer named Basil Polidorus, a friend from his university days, and asked him to build what Milius described as a continuous musical drama, something that would function almost like grand opera underneath the action. Milius won that fight. The result was a sweeping, choral, unmistakably epic score that many critics and fans still consider one of the finest achievements of 1980s film music. It's a small victory in the larger story, but it matters, because it shows that the tone of Conan the Barbarian we know today survived only because Milius fought for it, scene by scene, decision by decision. Which brings us to the part of this story that most casual fans have never heard about at all. The ending. The theatrical cut that opened in May of 1982 closes on a quiet, almost mournful note. After the final confrontation with the cult leader Thulsa Doom, we see Conan sitting alone on the temple steps, staring out at the aftermath, an older, wearier version of the boy we met at the start. A narrator briefly tells us that Conan would go on to many more adventures, setting up the possibility of sequels, and the film ends there. Solitary, ambiguous, unresolved. For years, that was the only ending most audiences knew existed. But that was not the only ending that was filmed, and it was not the only version of that closing sequence that Milius and his editors assembled. Decades later, when restoration teams went back through the surviving film elements for special edition home video releases, they uncovered additional footage that had been shot for the finale, but never used in the theatrical release. In this material, the princess character has a far more active presence throughout the climax. Instead of vanishing from the story earlier, as she does in the theatrical cut, she is shown helping Conan infiltrate Thulsa Doom's fortress, standing beside him during the final battle, and in the closing moments, walking with him toward the sunrise, rather than leaving him isolated on the temple steps. There is even a spoken epilogue from the wizard character Akiro, layered over the closing shots, giving the story a very different emotional close, less bleak, more hopeful, more like the beginning of a partnership than the end of a lone warrior's tragedy. Think about what that actually changes. The theatrical ending frames Conan as someone forever set apart by his trauma, a man who has won his revenge but lost the ability to simply be at peace with another person. The alternate ending, with the princess at his side and a warmer narration closing out the story, frames him as someone who has finally found companionship after a lifetime of loss. Same battle, same villain, same hero, completely different meaning. So why did audiences only get the lonelier version? Nobody has ever produced a single smoking gun memo that explains the exact reasoning behind that final trim. What we do know is the pattern. Throughout production, Milius consistently pushed toward a harder, more mythic, more emotionally isolated version of the story, one closer in spirit to a tragedy than a romance. De Laurentiis and the studio, meanwhile, were far more focused on pacing, runtime, and giving the film a tighter, more commercially digestible shape, especially after a full year of editing had already stretched the process far longer than a typical studio picture. A softer, more romantic ending with extended courtship material simply may not have fit the leaner, harder-edged rhythm the final cut was building toward. Whether that decision came from Milius trimming his own footage for pacing, or from studio pressure to move faster toward the credits, the effect was the same. The warmer ending was left behind, and the colder, more solitary image became Conan's defining final shot for the next several decades. There is a second layer to this mystery that deserves just as much attention, because it isn't only about romance, it's about horror. During the film's climactic assault on Thulsa Doom's stronghold, Conan and his allies pass through a chamber the fan community has nicknamed the Grim Larder, a room lined with fallen corpses that the cult apparently uses for food, along with a cauldron containing a severed hand. It's a genuinely disturbing image, and it raises an obvious question. Who are these victims? Are they simply captured tribal warriors, or are they something else entirely, something less human? The finished film never answers that question, but it was supposed to. According to accounts from people close to the production, additional deleted material existed that was meant to clarify exactly what these creatures were, revealing them as something other than ordinary human warriors, something closer to a separate, monstrous species entirely under Thulsa Doom's control. Without that footage, the finished film leaves the moment as unsettling background detail rather than a meaningful piece of world building. What audiences never saw was context. Context that would have deepened the sense that Thulsa Doom's cult wasn't just a band of raiders, but something closer to a force of genuine supernatural corruption. Instead, the ambiguity survived, and for over 40 years, fans have been left debating exactly what they were looking at in that room. There's a third piece of this puzzle worth pulling into the light, and it involves the quieter, more character-driven material Milius originally shot. One of the most beloved editions restored for later special editions is a scene that fans now refer to as the calm before the storm, a conversation between Conan and his companion Subotai, placed right after the funeral of Valeria and just before the preparations for the final battle. In this scene, the two warriors sit together and talk plainly about what it actually means to live as a barbarian, whether it is wise to stay and risk everything fighting Thulsa Doom, and they arrive at a quiet, almost resigned philosophy that all they can really count on is that the wind smells fresh right before a storm breaks. It's a small, intimate character beat, the kind of scene that slows the film down on purpose to let grief and camaraderie breathe before the action resumes. In the theatrical cut, that breathing room simply isn't there. The story moves directly from mourning into preparation for battle, and the emotional transition feels considerably more abrupt. Restoring that scene doesn't just add runtime, it restores a specific rhythm Milius clearly wanted, a rhythm built around reflection before violence, myth before spectacle. Without it, the theatrical Conan feels slightly more mechanical, a little less human in its pacing. With it, the film breathes the way a genuine tragedy should. None of these choices happened in a vacuum, and none of them were unique to the American theatrical print either. Different territories around the world ended up with genuinely different versions of this movie, which only adds to the sense that Conan the Barbarian was never really one fixed object. The version released in the United Kingdom trimmed several seconds of footage showing horses falling during the action sequences, a change made specifically to satisfy concerns about apparent animal welfare during production. It also shortened a sequence involving a witch character, removing a brief moment of undressed appearance and reducing the sound design in that scene. Meanwhile, an uncut international version circulated in certain markets that restored material trimmed from the American release entirely, including extended character material between Conan and Subotai before the mound battle sequence. There's also a quieter kind of evidence worth considering, the kind that comes from how the people who made this film have talked about it in the years since. Milius has described his approach to Conan less like a typical action movie assignment and more like an attempt to build a modern myth, treating the character's suffering and stoicism as something close to religious material rather than pulp entertainment. Critics who revisited the film decades later picked up on exactly that ambition, noting that Milius wasn't content simply adapting Howard's pulp stories, he was building something closer to an operatic, almost sacred story about survival and vengeance. That kind of filmmaking instinct doesn't naturally lend itself to a tidy, upbeat, romantic conclusion. It lends itself to exactly the kind of bleak, solitary final image the theatrical cut ultimately chose, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. The colder ending may not have been purely a studio-imposed compromise at all. It may have been the version that best matched what Milius, deep down, actually believed his story was about, even if the softer alternative had already been shot and sat waiting in the vault. Layer all of that together, and you start to see the real picture. Conan the Barbarian was never delivered to the world as a single, stable text. It existed as a set of overlapping, slightly contradictory versions, shaped by a UK broadcasting standard here, a studio pacing note there, a producer's discomfort with intensity in one place, and a director's insistence on mythic tone in another. Every audience, depending on where and when they watched it, was technically watching a slightly different film. For decades, most of that never mattered, because nobody outside the production had access to the missing material. The alternate ending, the extended Subotai scenes, the additional princess material, All of it sat quietly in vaults, occasionally mentioned in interviews but never widely seen. It wasn't until home video restoration efforts, decades after the theatrical release, that archivists and editors went back through the surviving film elements and pieced together a special edition that finally let audiences see some of what had been left behind. Even then, the reconstruction wasn't perfect. Some of the recovered footage carried visible differences in print quality, a reminder of just how close this material came to being lost entirely. So what does all of this actually tell us about the movie we think we know? It tells us that the emotionally distant, solitary version of Conan that became iconic, the image of a warrior alone on the steps of a ruined temple, was not an inevitability. It was a choice, made somewhere in an editing room over the course of more than a year, shaped by commercial pressure, pacing decisions, and a fundamental disagreement about what kind of story this was supposed to be. A slightly different set of decisions, and the character who became a symbol of stoic isolation could just as easily have ended his story walking toward a sunrise with someone beside him. It also tells us something about how fragile film history really is. This is not some obscure art house picture nobody remembers. This is one of the defining action films of the 1980s, the movie that helped turn Arnold Schwarzenegger into a global star. And even a film with that level of cultural weight came within a hair's breadth of having entire pieces of its emotional architecture disappear permanently, saved only because someone, years later, thought to go back into the archive and look. The truth was hidden for decades, not through some grand conspiracy, but through the much more ordinary process of film production. Footage gets cut. Reels get trimmed for pacing. Producers and directors disagree, and someone eventually wins the argument. The version that reaches the public becomes the only version most people ever know, and the alternate path, the one that could have existed instead, quietly fades from memory, unless someone makes the effort to dig it back up. Which leaves us with the real question at the heart of tonight's investigation. If the version of Conan the Barbarian we all grew up watching was never the only version, and possibly not even the version its own director considered complete, then how many other classic films are we still watching in an altered, unintended form without ever realizing it? We may never get a definitive answer for Conan. The people who made the final calls in that editing room decades ago have never given a full, detailed account of exactly why the softer ending was set aside in favor of the harder one. What we have instead are fragments, restored scenes, surviving interviews, and a pattern of decisions that points toward an answer without ever fully confirming it. So we'll leave it with you. Which ending do you think tells the truer story of Conan? The lonely warrior on the temple steps, or the one who finally isn't alone? Let us know in the comments, and if you want us to keep digging into the lost histories hiding behind the movies you grew up with, make sure you're subscribed, because this is far from the only mystery still buried in the archive.